Good morning and welcome back to the shop. On today's episode, we're going to start on our pine box project. It's the third project in our series, and it's going to be a clear distinction in our skill progression. Whereas before we were just learning how to use the tools safely and efficiently, now we're going to be combining individual parts to make a whole project. And each of those parts will have to fit precisely and perfectly together to form our pine box. So our skill level is going to be increasing quite a bit on this project. This project will make you use every tool in the shop just like before, but in addition, every tool will every part will have to be precisely manufactured so that everything fits together. Here you're taking a look at a couple of our sample projects. Some of these projects have been Lichtenberg burned, some of them have been burned with a torch, and some of them have just had regular finish applied. But regardless of your choice of finish, these are the projects that we're going to be working on today. So I hope you stay with me. This is a very fun project, and I look forward to seeing you in the shop. Now we can start getting into the project. So our first thing that we want to do is figure out what kind of lumber we have to use, and then find an appropriate piece, one that you like the looks of and one that will have enough board footage in it to cover your project's needs. In this case, this is the pine board I'm going to use, and this will cover every single piece for the pine box project except for one, and that is the bottom. The bottom is actually made out of 1/4-inch plywood, so we won't be using the pine wood to do that. We'll be using pine wood or plywood once we get there. So in our case, what I did was I roughly laid out all of the dimensions just to make sure that my project would fit on it. So I have a top piece here. The top piece is 9 3/4 inches long and 5.5 inches wide. While we're laying it out, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to get a rough idea to make sure everything fits. For the short sides, we're going to need 2 of them, and they're going to be 5 inches long and 4 1/4 inches wide. Okay? And then for the long side, we also need 2 of those. Those are going to be 9 3/4 inches long and 4 1/4 inches wide. So this board here will cover all of our needs. Depending on which piece of lumber you pick, you will probably have to arrange the pieces in a different order. If you didn't have a piece so wide, or if yours was longer, you just change the orientation of where you placed all the pieces. But in our case, this is the way I set it up, and it should work just fine. Now, every single one of these pieces needs to be 1/2 inch thick, and so I'm going to go ahead and take this to the planer and just plane this down to 1/2 inch before I start cutting it into little pieces. And the reason I'm doing that is because since they're all the same exact thickness, what I can do is get them to the correct thickness before I start squaring the board up. If I wait until I square the board up and I start cutting off pieces, sometimes you'll end up with a piece that's too small to plane. And that is what would happen on this board, because the top would only be 9 3/4 inches long, and that's barely enough to go through our planer, and you end up getting a fair amount of snipe on it. So I'm going to actually plane the whole board first just to get it down to 1/2 inch, and then I'll go square it up. This board is not cupped or twisted or warped much, so it should not be a problem in my case. Sometimes you'll need to square it up before you go ahead and plane it though, but in our case we should be fine planing it first. Let's go see how it turns out. We're going to go ahead and plane this board down to 1/2 inch. I just wanted to remind you, make sure every time you feed it through the planer that you're flipping it over. What that does is it helps keep the stresses a little more even in the board and will help keep it from bowing. So it's a very important thing to do that. So always flip it over every time you feed the board through. That way you're taking an equal amount off of both sides to help equalize the stresses in the board. Now it's just a simple matter of repeating what you've already learned in the first couple projects, which is how to square a board. We're going to do We're going to skip the faces because those came done already, and then we're going to move on to the edge joint one side, table saw the other, miter saw both ends, and then we'll have a squared up board. Well, we've got the board all squared, and now that it's squared, we can start figuring out where our pieces are going to come out of. So the top is kind of a unique part of this project in that it does not need to be square. I'm going to talk more about it later and it'll make more sense. But for now, what we're trying to do is lay out a piece for the top that's bigger than what we need. So the piece is supposed to be 9 3/4 inches long. So I'm going to make it around 10 1/2 inches just to make it a little bit big. And then it's supposed to be 5 1/2 inches wide, and I'm going to make it around 6 inches. And that way it'll just make sure that it's bigger than what I need. And I'll show you why we do that later on. Okay, so I'll make it around 10 1/2 inches long, put a little mark there, and we're going to make it around 6 inches wide. And then I'll use a square to just kind of roughly lay this thing out here. So I've got the rough size of the top piece all laid out. We're going to go over to the bandsaw and cut this thing out. It does not need to be a perfect cut because it doesn't need to be square. And again, I'll explain a little more of that later on. The top has been cut out. I'll just label that top so I don't get confused later on. It's done. And now I simply need to cut some 4 1/4 inch strips. Since all 4 of our pieces are going to be 4 1/4 inches, it's relatively an easy procedure to go ahead and cut those. Now, I do have one issue that I want to bring up, and this side here is perfectly fine to do the 4 1/4. But on this side, if I do that 4 1/4, I'll be very close into the edge of this knot. And I don't want to have a knot on the edge of my projects. I love the looks of knots in the middle of a project, but on the edge of a project, it's going to give you a structural issue. So I want to try to work around that and keep the knots since I like the way they look. So what I'm going to do is figure out, I want to be a little bit higher than the knot here. So I'm going to put my 4 1/4 inches right about here where I'd like it. That gives me about, I don't know, 1/2 inch of space. And what I'm going to do is put a little mark on the board here and then run it to the end. And what I'm going to do is before I start cutting out my strips, I'm going to cut this tiny little strip off so that way when I do cut my piece, it will come out in the spot that I want it to end up at. Now, whenever we cut 2 or more pieces to the same exact size, I want you to always follow this policy. When you cut 2 or more pieces to the same size, you need to cut them at the same time. That's going to eliminate any errors of where our pencil is, how fat the lead is. Did I use one tape measure on one measurement and another one on another? Did I drop my tape measure in between? It just eliminates all of that kind of error that can creep into your projects. So since the 2 are, I should say all 4 of the sides or the 2 cuts that we're going to make for them, since they're both going to be 4 1/4, I want to be able to do them at the same time. So I got to think ahead and do that one little cut first. And that's what you'll see me do now, and then I'll cut out all of the final parts for the project. I'm going to need to square the end of this board up anyways, so I'm going to go ahead and re-square the ends of these two boards that I'm using for all the side pieces.